It's roughly 83 years, I can hardly bear to think of it, since the day in March 1939 when I arrived at London's Liverpool Street Station and greeted my quasi-foster parents with the only English word I knew by saying goodbye. I was a Kindertransport child and had come from Vienna, my birthplace. And today I stand here as a woman who has had a career as a journalist and writer, who has travelled widely, has made her home in Britain, and has been honoured by the Queen with the CBE. I'm a commander of the British Empire. I also have an honorary doctorate from this university from Sussex, which gave me enormous pleasure when I got it. All of this could be presented as a straightforward story of success. The transformation of a child refugee into a well-regarded career woman, a role model to some extent for women in journalism. It's a story of a refugee's assimilation into British life and culture. But of course, it's not been that straightforward. After all these long years since 1939, and with a wealth of experience, I still grapple with unresolved problems of insecurity and identity. And often I'm trapped, I feel trapped in some invisible prison from which there is no escape. I realize, of course, that I'm by no means alone among refugees in confronting these problems, and who also see themselves as a constant challenge to the stability of their lives. But of course, people have different ways of dealing with these problems. I'm going to try and describe my ways and explain why I have, after a long life, still really been unable to resolve them fully. And indeed, thanks to Brexit, I'm confronting new challenges to my sense of identity. There is one key element, I think, that has colored my entire life, or at least my life since the age of 10 when I left Austria. The fact was that I was uprooted from the country of my birth and had to adjust to a new home and to assimilate to a different culture. And even though I was still a young child, obviously, when I came to Britain, when I was put on that Kindertransport train, about which I'm going to talk in a moment, and brought to London. And that rupture with the country of my origin has been profound, certainly far more profound than I would have realized at the time of my arrival in Britain. And it took me a long time, really, to realize just what all of that meant. Linked to the rupture of my roots during the large parts of my life, I've been reluctant to acknowledge my Jewish identity. And it's really only in recent years that I have come to understand that Jewish culture can enhance and steady my life. I should add that I'm a secular Jew, and I don't do any religious practice at all. I'm an agnostic. I've also, I think some of the problems of adjustment have been affected by the fact that my parents were divorced when I was only 3 years old, and I've really never had a father figure in my life. So the mother-daughter relationship has been particularly close, was very close. Sadly, my mother died many years ago. If I tell you a little bit about my background in Austria, I came from a middle-class family, a secular family. I went to primary school. It was a mixed school. I had Jewish friends, I had non-Jewish friends. I was a happy child. And then in 1938, when Hitler arrived in Austria, everything, of course, changed. I personally don't have many memories. I have very few memories of this childhood in Vienna, and I don't really remember the terrible events of the Kristallnacht, when the Jews of Vienna were under complete attack and so much was destroyed. What I do remember is that my mother decided we could not continue to live in the suburbs of Vienna. It was not safe. And we moved into the inner city to stay with friends in a very beautiful flat, but right in the center of the city. And then one day there was the knock on the door, and Gestapo came and took my mother away. And miraculously, she came back. And this happened a second time. And after that, my mother decided that she had to bring me to safety. And the only way of bringing me to safety was to try and get me onto a Kindertransport, that great scheme about which people talk a great deal to this day, when about 12,000 children from Germany and from Austria were brought to safety in Britain. And I was one of the lucky children who was able to be taken on the Kindertransport, and that is how I landed in London. I want to say a few words about the Kindertransport, which is always held up rightly as a wonderful rescue operation undertaken by the British government and which clearly saved many children's lives. But what I've only been discovering more recently is it was a very selective process. On the whole, only children from a middle-class background who would fit easily into British life were selected for the Kindertransport. And many of the so-called shtetl children from Eastern Europe, Orthodox Jewish refugees who had landed in Austria, had fled from persecution in Eastern Europe. Many of those children were already orphaned because their parents had already been taken to concentration camps. And unfortunately, most of these children were rejected and were not allowed to go onto the Kindertransport because at the British end, the committee that was vetting the selection of the children only wanted children that would fit easily into the atmosphere, into British life, and also would be 100% healthy and would eventually, as they hoped, be able to go to what was then still Palestine and work towards the creation of the Zionists, of Israel. So that is a rather, to my mind, a rather ugly side of the Kindertransport, because so many of the children that were left behind died, they were orphaned and perished in the war. Anyway, as far as I was concerned, as soon as I arrived at England, I had my adoptive parents. My mother, of course, had stayed behind in Austria, and I was put to school and very quickly seemed to have learned English and adapted into living in London. My mother, fortunately, was also able to come to Britain, but she only on what was called a domestic permit. She had to work as a servant, as a domestic servant, and she ended up working as a cook because the people who employed her decided they wanted above all to have traditional English food like apfelstrudel, and she could make that for them. Anyway, that is, my mother landed with a wonderful family who not only had a house in London but also in the Lake District in northern England, and I was invited to come and stay with them, and we ended up spending the entire war in the Lake District. My mother had to work as a cook throughout those years, and though I was given a free place in a private school in Ambleside in the Lake District and bicycled to school every single day. But I was the servant's child, and the family where my mother worked as cook, she was treated as a servant, and I was the child, which was a very difficult situation for me, particularly since my school friends all came from very affluent backgrounds, and I tried to hide what was happening to me. And I did not want to tell them how I was growing up. But at the age of 17, I was lucky enough to be accepted to the London School of Economics. And that is where I began to adapt much more closely to life, to end this isolated life that I've been living as a school child in the Lake District. At 17, when I went to LSE, I think I was too young and too immature to enjoy university life. I wish I could have done it. If I'd been a year older, I would probably have been happier. As it was, I was just simply determined to get a good degree and emerge from the London School of Economics ready for life, and hopefully to adapt much more to the new British culture that I had grown up in, but always to some extent in the margins of life. In 1946, I acquired my British nationality and a British passport. But I also started making my first trips back to Austria. But I saw myself as a tourist. I saw very clearly what I'd lost. I could see that I had been uprooted from the country in which I was born. I felt almost like a stranger coming there. It took many, many years before my feelings towards Austria changed, but I will come back to that in a moment. Once I had my degree from the London School of Economics, my working life began. I was really quite unsure. I was unsure what I really wanted to do. But of course, those were times when there were plenty of jobs available, plenty of choice. I landed, oddly enough, doing market research for something called the Colonial Development Corporation, which was at that time a British organization trying to develop, working on development projects mainly in East Africa, but also in West Africa. But I soon realized that a 9-to-5 working life was not exactly what I wanted, and I was still all the time trying to find out where I belonged, who I was, what my identity really was. And then accidentally, without any great ambitions in that direction, I fell into journalism. I answered an advertisement in the New Statesman, which led to my being made the commercial editor of a paper called West Africa. And for me, that was an enormous change in life, particularly because it took me to West Africa. And I'm now going back to the late 1950s. This was the time when the countries of West Africa, both the colonies, British colonies, French colonies, were negotiating for their independence. And I was plunged into this to write about these developments. And I found myself as certainly the only European woman reporter in that area. I became friends with the men, with journalists, but I was the only woman. And in a way, that was the beginning of, first of all, finding my new identity as a professional woman, working in her own right, within her own right, and being respected by her colleagues. And it was a fascinating time because I came to know the leaders, political leaders of French West Africa, British West Africa, and in those days there was security was a very different matter. These people were all freely available, one had access to them, and I learned my craft. But of course, remember, this was a time before the internet, before social media, before computers. I had to work. I had to write many of my articles by hand, quite often just simply dictating them off the top of my head. There was no Google, nothing. We had to do far more research. But it was exciting. It was a different world, but it was a different craft. It was a profession. You still basically had to establish fact and analyze, but it was not, we didn't have all the props that the media world has today, and we didn't have the competition from the social media. But that is how I learned my craft. And I was fortunate enough to establish some links to the Guardian newspaper, and ended up after 3 or 4 years of working in this West African field and having all the excitement of new countries emerging out of in West Africa, that the Guardian newspaper took me on and sent me to the United Nations as their UN correspondent. And this led to a career of almost 40 years working for the Guardian, mostly writing on foreign affairs. I was posted after the United Nations. I worked out of Washington. I met President Kennedy. I went on the Selma March. I got to know an amazing range of people from all parts of the American continent. I covered presidential election campaigns. And then I switched to Europe and was first based in Geneva, then in London, and then again back to Washington at one point. And I covered the fading years of the Cold War. So I had a very exciting time, and you would think that all of this would generate much greater security, that my identity would become much clearer to me. And yet there was always that nagging feeling, I still have to prove myself. I still don't quite know who I am. Am I British? Am I European? What is my Jewish identity? And all of this combined together, always to wanting more and more confirmation of who I was and what I was, and still always feeling hemmed in, and this sense of insecurity which didn't seem to leave me. By 1996, that's quite a while ago now too, I had been with the Guardian really for a very long time, and the editor of the Guardian decided that I was rather older than most of the Guardian's readers, and he made it clear that time was up. And that, again, was shattering. Insecurity was really right back on the forefront of my whole existence. And then I was lucky. Some of you may have heard of Lord George Weidenfeld. He was the creator of Weidenfeld and Nicholson's, the publisher, and later became very much a public figure, working in many areas of life, and was in the House of Lords and so on. And he asked me to come and work with him he had established, or he was in the process of establishing, a small think tank which has become the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which today is much concerned with counter-terrorism and counter-radicalization. But when I first came to work with George Weidenfeld, when this was in its infancy, it was a bridge-building organization which tried to build cultural bridges by bringing people together from Britain, France, and Germany, later from Austria and later from the United States and Russia. And I looked after the media and culture programs, and in the process was able to go to China and establish a media exchange with Chinese journalists and European journalists. But the most important thing, before I started actually working for the Institute, George Weidenfeld suggested I should write a biography of Simon Wiesenthal. Some of you may know that he was well known as a Nazi hunter, one of a number of people after the war who tried to bring to justice some of the Nazi perpetrators who had done such dreadful things during the Holocaust, with the whole idea that by exposing their crimes in a court of justice, this would make people understand they would learn much more about the Holocaust and what had happened. Sorry, that's another story which I won't go into today because that would take too long. But by working on this biography, it also brought me much closer to thinking more about my Jewish identity, about anti-Semitism, and of course about the Holocaust. And it made me realize that I had much to gain by acknowledging my Jewish identity, not by trying to hide from being Jewish, but by acknowledging who I am and what I am, and understanding what Jewish culture can contribute, obviously to the generality, but also to my own personal search for identity. And to me, working on that book was very important, and then working again with George Weidenfeld, who himself was committed to the state of Israel, and that was probably one of his what he identified more than almost anything else in his life, and also who was fighting against anti-Semitism, and who made me much more aware of the challenges that we face today with anti-Semitism, even though I personally cannot say that I've been a victim of anti-Semitism myself, but I've come to understand the issues much more clearly now, of course, and that is one reason why I'm so happy that Sussex University has not only established the Chair of Israel Studies here, but also, of course, that it has long hosted the German Jewish Studies Center, which is focused on Holocaust studies, now on much wider anti-Semitism issues, and above all has helped to create the Weidenfeld Institute of Jewish Studies, which again is now deeply committed, and I hope will expand its activities in that area. And I have involved myself to a small extent to help fundraise for the Institute, because I think it is such an important institution. Before I want to, sorry, I should come. What I wanted to stress is that through this work, I have come to understand much more that I have multiple identities, all of which help to give me a certain degree of security, but I'm still searching for the ultimate answers. And to some extent, Brexit has propelled me into questioning my identity once again, because I thought that I could be certain after all these years of living in this country, in Britain, that I had really, truly assimilated and to Britain, that British culture was at the center of my life, that my British identity was secure. And then we had Brexit, because at heart I'm a European and not just a British citizen. And Brexit has now made me question to what extent I really have acquired a British identity. And I'm going to end this talk by reading to just a few words from a book that a memoir that I published last year, which really discusses many of the issues that I've touched on today, and where I come to a rather sad conclusion. And I will read you the last page from that book. And it is this: the British government's decision to make the definitive break with Brussels at the end of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic and profound economic crisis, was bad enough. But for the bulk of British people to accept that without protest, and indeed to welcome the prospect of this new independent sovereign state, seemed to me even worse. I cannot identify with this mindset. Lockdown provided the opportunity to reflect ever more deeply about my bundle of identities, my self-worth and my self-doubts. But if self-distancing has become the signature tune of lockdown, self-distancing from Britishness has become my personal heartache. The net result: I no longer know where I really belong. My bundle of identities no longer has tangible priorities. Yes, I realize that identities can enrich each other and help one to understand each identity more clearly. And yet, if I question my British identity, can I give my Austrian identity pride of place? Not really. There will always be reservations about Austria's actions during the Nazi era. The European identity is foremost a cultural concept. The Jewish identity sits in the background, but doesn't give me the anchor that my British identity provided for many decades. So where does this leave me with my insecurities? They haven't gone away. I'm still in my invisible cage, but that cage is now floating in a world undergoing profound change. I have no way of knowing what will happen to that cage, or even to the person within, in the post-pandemic world. So that's where I am today. It's an inconclusive end, but I hope I've given you some thoughts that you might question, some thoughts that you might reflect on. And thank you very much indeed for listening to me.
Take a seat. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I think anybody not familiar with your life story would have been really entranced, and those familiar with it would have heard an awful lot. And really, I have to start off by your ending and the doubt. Anybody who knows your career as a preeminent foreign correspondent over the years for The Guardian would be staggered to hear you say, I don't know if I've had a successful career. You have had a successful career, but why the doubt?
It's always been with me. There's always been that need for affirmation, for recognition, for just a search for certainty. There is a basic insecurity, and as I think I said at the beginning of my talk, it has a lot to do with being uprooted. It's just, there's a loss there that you never quite recover.
Do you think that it's also been the dynamic that's propelled your career, that's made you seek to show initiative, going for new jobs, new experiences? Has it had a positive side?
Oh, I'm quite certain you're right. I've written, my latest book is a book called my memoir, Invisible Walls. And I think I have made quite clear in this that for me, work has been a form of escapism. It's by focusing and concentrating heavily on my work. And we didn't go into this today when I talked earlier, but to some extent neglecting my private life, or anyway, unfortunately, making some bad choices in my private life. But in terms of my work, that has been my escapism from my insecurities, from my faults, from my mistakes. It's the one area where I've felt a degree of security, which I haven't found anywhere else.
As a plug for your book, those who are interested in your private life will find lots about it in the book.
But of course I want to plug my book.
You've written very frankly about your private life, but let's just focus on other aspects at the moment. I just wanted to go right back. I'm sort of surprised. Clearly, your childhood was incredibly important to you in one sense. You've carried it through, and yet you have such few memories of it.
Well, I have very few memories of my early childhood in Austria, but I have very full memories of my childhood in Britain. And to me, pre-Britain is a sort of not a closed chapter, but only a half-open chapter.
Do you think your subconsciousness has sort of censored the original Austrian experience because it was unhappy or ambivalent?
I don't know. I think it was a happy it was a happy childhood, but not a straightforward childhood, because I was with, I have virtually no memories of my father. I never met him again. My father emigrated to America in '38. He managed to get away, managed to get to America before, obviously, and I never saw him again. I was due to travel to America in, I think, 1957, the first time. And by the time I was ready to go to America, he had died. And he took no interest in me at all. During the war, I know that the refugee organizations in Britain tried to track him down and actually tried to make some contribution to him. There was one thing I didn't mention in my talk. We were desperately poor, because my mother was just, she'd come with nothing. Everything had to be left behind, as refugees were forced to do in Austria. And she just had a very meager pay as a domestic. I was lucky to be supported in my schooling, my school fees. But there was a point where my headmistress, the headmistress in my school, voluntarily bought my textbooks because she knew my mother couldn't afford to buy them. So, we were really very poor for many years, not until after the war, and basically when I began to earn some money, and also my mother was able to work as a milliner. So, those years are very vivid in my mind. But the pre-war, the Austrian part of my life, it just remains as a sort of rather happy. I have visions of myself as a child playing in a park and things like that. It was a happy childhood, but not one that left many memories.
Just to capture one memory, can you recall, I know you've written about it, but can you recall when you arrived at Liverpool Street Station, and I was recently, and I'm sure you've been at that rather beautifully designed Kindertransport Memorial, can you recall your first sensation, fear, surprise, what concern? Can you recapture that moment?
I can recapture walking into a large hall and seeing huddles of people, the people who had contracted to, because each Kindertransport child only had a visa if there was a family that would take the child and commit themselves to looking after it. And I could see the huddles of different people welcoming their new charges, and I remember walking up to mine, and as I mentioned, I think I said goodbye, which was the only English word that I knew, and I remember being taken to their house, which was in West London, in West Hampstead, in Bronsbury, not that far from where I live today. And then I remember the family being very welcoming, and all those early things I remember, but the actual sensation of arriving in Liverpool Street and in that hall, as I say, I just remember that, you know, my people, which was Mrs. Infield, the mother of the
She had a
house.
sign saying Hella. How did you know her?
I think that there were people around, volunteers, who were marrying up the children. I think we all had name boards with our names on them, and they knew how to find the foster parents.
You were, in your talk and in your book, quite critical of some aspects of the Kindertransport, but given that they would only, young children like you only got a visa if there was a family willing to take them, surely it was inevitable that families were going to say, we want a healthy child, we want an intelligent child, and that's why the children from the shtetl, as you described, were excluded.
No, because if you read the literature now, which is, a lot of research is being done, because this whole situation of the discrimination, of the selection of the children, it really wasn't addressed for a very long time. And it's only in the last few years there's some British academics who actually began to look more deeply into who actually got, how the children were selected. And the chair of the group that had originally campaigned to rescue the children, and to their great credit, they overcame the objections of Neville Chamberlain and the British government, who really didn't want to undertake this scheme. They got it through, but from the very beginning, their concept was that they wanted children not only able to fit fairly easily into the British context and not generate anti-Semitism and all the rest of it, but also because essentially they saw these children as material that would be able to go and fight the good Zionist war in Palestine. And it is not widely known that the children were actually only given temporary visas. They were not permanent visas, because the whole idea was that they would move on. So they were, and this committee was so strict about the selection to be certain that the children were 100% healthy, that one of the things that I found, a postcard that I wrote to my mother on the day after I arrived, I stressed that even on the boat from Harwich, we had medical examinations, and if I hadn't passed the medical examination, I would have been sent back. And even children where they found that the parents, parent had committed suicide, that in itself was a negative to the child not to be admitted.
So quite striking, and in some contrast to the popular image. But I wonder whether it was a result of, before you came or when you were here, I'm talking now about your Jewish identity, which you talk about, did you consciously suppress it? Did you consciously, on your guard, Jews were oppressed in Vienna, England doesn't really want us, I'm going to keep it quiet? Did your mother tell you that? Or was that a natural reaction, or didn't you do that at all?
My mother didn't tell me. My mother was an agnostic to start with, so she never encouraged religion in me. But no, I know that I wanted to hide it. I would not, I refused to speak German until I had a school teacher who finally persuaded me that I couldn't lose my mother tongue. If my mother so much as addressed a sentence in German outside the house, I would scream at her. I mean, really scream at her.
Because?
Because German was associated with the Nazis.
But not with the Jewish background?
not with the Jewish, but the Jewish background was all part and parcel of it, because I was persecuted. And, you know, if she spoke German, I would be seen as Jewish. I would be persecuted. That was the connection.
But what's surprising?
Well, it's not logical, but that's, as a child,
none of us are.
That's the way.
Here's another lack of logic, if you like. You went back to Austria very early, 1946, I think you said, whereas most victims of the Nazis who fled took a long time for them to want to go back.
Well, I think 46 is when I got my British nationality. Well, the thing is, first of all, and I consider that lucky, my mother did not belong to the kind of refugees who saw Austria as inherently anti-Semitic and who to this day cannot bring themselves to go back to Austria. I'm convinced that if she had had the means to do it, my mother probably would have gone back to Austria after the war. To live, as, you know, certainly others, a small number of refugees did do. And in my case, the reason why I went to Austria was actually because when my mother, all her belongings were sequestered by the Nazis, and one of her friends who's not Jewish, and I've discussed this person in the book I've written, I won't go into that now, she knew that he had taken care of, managed to rescue a few things, and she herself at that point didn't want to go back to Austria and couldn't, and I don't think would have wanted to, but she wanted me to go to see what there was, if there was anything that could still be brought to Britain. And I now have in my flat a couple of paintings that I brought back, and, you know, just tiny things. But basically, everything has been auctioned off by the Nazis during the war, and everything was gone. But that is how I went back to Austria, not because there was any great longing to go back. She wanted me to go back.
Shortly afterwards, and I'm now moving on to your journalistic career, you were, and I say lucky enough, to be working in Africa in the 50s when the famous wind of change was sweeping through the continent. That must have been very exciting times.
It was very exciting, and of course one of the things that strike me today, which is so interesting, is at that time the African leadership was concerned with the future, what kind of new world they were creating. The Pan-African ideas were very much in the forefront, and of course independence. And there was virtually no discussion that I can recall of racism, of slavery, of of colonial history. That did not preoccupy minds at that time. It did not cloud or enrich, whichever way you want to look at it, the discussion at the time. It was all about the future planning. And to me, this is so interesting. The mindset was very, very different. These were all people who were sure of themselves, self-confident, far less worried by history than they were interested in the future, the present and the future, much less so in the past. And it was a very, very different kind of mindset. And I find that fascinating to think back on it. But I also have to say that even there wasn't very little discussion about religion, about Islam, about extremism of any form. You know, there were debates about, was the Western-style democracy valid in the new countries? And as I say, there was a dream of achieving African unity and prosperity. It is just so interesting for someone who lived through that era to be living in the present world and following the very different debates around colonialism that, of course, is so important to us today.
And such a different political scene across Africa now.
Absolutely. You know, the Africa that everybody dreamt of really didn't happen.
Although we've both seen apartheid fall, which has to be one of the pluses of our generation. But actually thinking back, not just to Africa, but you've listed very briefly your who's who of world statesmen. Who, most of all the people you've come across professionally and personally, has most stood out for you as the outstanding personality that you've encountered?
You know, I've been asked this question so often.
Sorry, I'll try and be more original next time.
And I try to find different answers.
No, give us the best answer.
Because it always makes me... I find this an almost impossible question to answer because, you know, I've met important people in such different circumstances. But, you know, let me not sing out one person, but sing out just more than one. To me personally, I always, Willy Brandt was the former German Chancellor, was, I think, the most important political figure that I met, for the simple reason, when I first got to know him, the discussion was really not about politics. It was about morality, it was about the Holocaust, it was about the Nazis, it was about history. It helped me to understand and reconcile myself to the German nations and to Germany, and indeed turned me into a very close friend of Germany and a great admirer of post-war Germany. But it was Willy Brandt who somehow made me understand much better the sort of whole, the history of the Holocaust, of Nazism, of Germany, and I will always be eternally grateful to the way he managed to turn my thoughts and my attitudes and my understanding. So I would single him out. I think in terms of America, obviously I met President Kennedy briefly. I'm a great admirer, but I think of the presidents that I covered during the times when I covered American affairs, to me, Lyndon Johnson is still the most important figure because he really he helped America he created. But he achieved the voting rights for Afro-Americans, which of course is the most important.
Yeah, he's a very unsung hero of civil rights, but you're right, he was clearly important.
His civil rights, the civil rights legislation that he managed to get through Congress is a remarkable feat, and he was a remarkable personality.
Given his own background, he came a Southerner, and yet he achieved, as you say, these great breakthroughs.
He understood what needed to be done, and he had the clout in the Congress. You know, I mean, when you look at the Congress today, and the Congress that he was dealing with, but of course he was a different president. If we had a president like Lyndon Johnson today, maybe even this Congress might act and not just sit on its haunches.
You're talking about then and now. I was just wondering, and you briefly touched upon it when you mentioned social media. Would you rather be a journalist today, or would you rather be a journalist starting in the 50s?
I think rather be a journalist in the 50s.
Because?
I think, today journalism is so confused, so mixed up. The social media cloud the professionalism of journalism. At first, I mentioned in my talk that I was involved in a media exchange with Chinese journalists, and when they were coming to Europe, we ran sort of discussion groups with European journalists, and I think we realized then, how far journalism had moved from the kind of work that the likes of me did. And today's journalism, which is so mixed up with commercialism and where it is so hard to sustain the genuine search for facts, for truth, and for independent analysis, it's very, very hard to achieve that today. And of course, financially, the situation has changed enormously.
It's a tough world for journalists in many ways today. We can't escape the question of identity, which I have to come back to. One of the identities you didn't mention, of course, is your identity as a journalist, which is a badge you should wear with some pride. But one of the other questions that was in my mind was, in your search, and you rediscovered or discovered your identity as a Jew, did you not think about realizing that identity by going to live in Israel?
I've thought about it. Again, I should have mentioned that in my talk. When I was still working for my original journal, West Africa, I was covering the independence the independence celebrations of the day when Nigeria became independent, and that was a big sort of party that went on for 3 or 4 days. But people from all over the world were invited to that, and at that independence celebration, I met a senior Israeli diplomat who was one of the guests. And it turned out his name was Ivor Gaber, but he was an Austrian by origin, like myself, older than me, had been in 1939 and 1938 in the youth aliyah in Vienna, and became involved in the organization of the children's transport, of the Kindertransport. And I sort of realized that it maybe thanks to him that I was on the Kindertransport, and therefore, my subsequent life, I owed it all to him in a bizarre kind of way. And anyways, we became good friends, and he tried to persuade me to come and move to Israel. He said, I would easily find work there. The Jerusalem Post would give me a job, and other English language. I spoke no Hebrew, and he pressed me, and he said, you'd be happier there, you would find yourself. And I said, no, I can't. I visited Israel on several occasions, but I know it's not a country I want to live in. I don't think it's too small for me.
And we're going to coming to the end now, and we can't shift from identity because it's such a central part of the book. And do you think, this search for identity, none of us, really, we all have multiple identities. A famous sociologist, Stuart Hall, you're probably familiar with, talked about us all having multiple identities. Do we need to have a fixed identity? Maybe you're searching for something that doesn't exist.
Look, I agree with you. I think, it's sort of become high fashion to talk about identity and searching for identities and who are you, what are you. But I think it comes back not so much to identity per se, but to the question of what is secure and what is insecure. And I just, maybe I'm sure I make too much of it because, as I've been saying, as you've been saying, I've had so many good things happen to me all my life. So, I shouldn't be talking like this. But, I know myself, and I know that this insecurity is there. If I talk about identity, it's part of the whole sort of internal debate that I have with myself about why am I insecure, what is it that would make me more secure. And I think that's why I'm talking about invisible walls. Or maybe the walls are identity issues, maybe it's pride, prejudice, it could be, but it's somewhere at the back of it, and I think it is a problem that most refugees in one way and another face, whether they can voice it or explain it or analyze it. Not everybody can, but I think on the whole, it is a phenomenon that it's part of being a refugee.
You ended the talk and you end the book very poignantly, and we'll end this interview talking briefly about Brexit and identity, because I do think that it does pose that question for all of us, or many of us. I certainly shared that ambivalence with you. Do you agree? You seem to be suggesting that Brexit poses a challenge for all, let's just talk about British Jews. It suddenly requires them to sort of make a determination, I am British, I'm not part of this European project.
I don't think it poses a challenge to Jews in particular. I think it poses a challenge to certainly to people who were not born in this country, who do not have a British heritage. Because what I'm questioning is, have I really assimilated into the British character, into, call it identity or character, British culture? I can no longer identify with the train of thought that makes the argument for Brexit. And I know that I have friends who were British to the core and generations back who are also grappling with this issue. But I think for people who were not born in this country, who were not part of the British tradition, this is a much more acute challenge. And that is what I'm talking about. But it doesn't have anything to do with Jewishness per se. I don't identify this with anti-Semitism in Britain. I identify with a character that has a concept of this I mean, Johnson has expressed it with the phrase global Britain, with this concept that there's something rather unique and very special and rather grandiose about Britain, which I think completely disregards Britain's affinity with Europe and with European culture. And that is where I part ways. That is where I'm so unhappy, where I ask myself, am I really still part of this British nation that I thought I had adopted and had made my own?
Well, Hella, thank you very much for the moment. That's enough questions for me. Now we're going to go to the live event where you are all going to be invited to continue this conversation by asking Hella questions either arising from her talk, from the interview, or anything else. I'm sure she's prepared to answer most questions.
I hope there'll be some really challenging questions.
I'm sure there will. So for the moment, Hella, thank you very much.
Thank you.